Hey everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the bench build. So it is Friday night. I got off early today, sort of. Got home and I had to deal with yet another issue. Okay, so I put everything on. I put everything onto the bench. She's looking good, ain't she? I put everything on. I got both holes drilled yesterday, and I was supposed to. The goal was to get it glued up last night, but that didn't happen because I got the holes drilled. I bolted this section up, and I bolted that apron on, the front apron, and then when I put the front top up, the front slab. I started just kind of going over the bench and making sure everything was the way I wanted it before I started doing the glue up and everything. And so I started measuring, because the next step is fitting up the wellboard. So I started measuring the distance, the gap in between both the slabs. And it turned out that there was a quarter inch difference between this end and that end. So I was like, well, okay. I thought about just shaving it off one of the tops, or shaving like an eighth off of this side, an eighth off of that side, kind of feathered out, and who cares? It's a workbench, right? But then I'm like, I have spent a lot of time and energy on building this bench to be not pretty, but, having all the measurements and everything is as close to perfect as I can get anyhow. With hand tools. I know it is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'll point out all the flaws and everything in the videos that I do to kind of recap and capture everything throughout the build when I do them at the end. But I had the gap that was, or the wellboard gap that was different measurements on either end, and I thought about doing, feathering it in the middle and whatnot, and just be done with it. But then, my nature kicked in, and I'm like, that's not the right way to do it. Let's just figure it out. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to rush it. I'm not going to clamp up tonight. I'm not going to do the glue up tonight at the top. I'll just figure it out in the morning when I get off work. So I get off work today. I get home, totally assuming that I would unbolt everything, pull them up, and that I would find the culprit, right? So like maybe one of my housing dados was deeper than the rest, or one wasn't cut deep enough, or my legs were somehow not the same width, or maybe the tops weren't the same width. On the same width on one end as they are on the other. Something. Maybe there was a wood chip stuck in there somewhere or something. So I pulled it all apart. I checked all that stuff, and nothing. Everything was right on the money where it was supposed to be. So I couldn't figure it out. I was like, what the hell? So I called up my buddy Roger, and we Skyped. And we were kind of talking through and walking through what could be the issue. And realistically, we didn't really find a whole lot of issues Other than we thought, okay, well maybe the legs racked a little bit, and it kind of racked the bench. As you know, as I'm kind of bolting it up and throwing the wedges and everything in, maybe they just racked or whatever. And so I threw my carpenter square on the inside, and which I was already doing to begin with my regular, well, my combination square, but it's just not big enough for something like this. You need two long edges. So I grabbed my carpenter square, and sure enough, the legs were not, with both aprons bolted on, the legs were not, with both aprons bolted on and the wedges in place, it was not square. It was only off by a little bit, but it wasn't square. So we squared it up as best we could, bolted it down again, and it was still a little bit off square. So we came up with the idea of instead of taking, you know, because it did rack. It racked this way. Both of them were racked that way. So that's what the indications I was reading on the square. So with it racked this way, that means that this side and this side are long. Like if you take a tape measure and measure from corner to corner, this side was longer than this, that corner, that diagonal was longer than this one. So the idea was to pull these two together, and it would, kind of like I was doing with the legs, pull these two together to pull it square. You know, all this has to happen at a bare minimum before I run the bolts or the lag screws up through the bears into the top. Because wherever I do that, that's where it's staying. That's it. So I wanted to figure this out, and maybe that was causing the gap to be uneven and whatnot. So we started playing with. I was trying to pull it, but I didn't have a clamp that was long enough, that had wide enough jaws to get all the way around a diagonal 6x6, or diagonally on a 6x6. So I just flipped the clamps around on one of my bar clamps, and instead of pulling these two legs together, I pushed these two legs apart. And I set up some 2x4s to act as sacrificial pressing blocks, if you will. And it didn't take a whole lot. Just once I got it snugged up, I took a couple turns and kept an eye on it. I'd turn it, check it, turn it, check it, and a couple turns, and it was square. It's good and square. I mean, perfect. Both of them were all four corners on the inside are square, and we are good to go. So at that point, I measured again, and I was still off by 3/16 across a 7-foot distance now, but it was 3/16 too much for me. So I continued to look at it and kind of figure out, what am I missing here, right? Because everything was perfect. The legs are exactly the same width, within probably a 64th of each other. The dado housings are all exactly the same. Of course, I routed them out with the poor man's router, so that was good. The width of the tops from end to end are less than a 64th apart from each other on both slabs. So there's really, I kept the only thing that did help, and I did this, but I didn't really want to do this to an extreme because, quite frankly, I didn't know how. I had checked my boards, so I didn't want I didn't want to believe that it was not flat anymore, but the aprons, we already talked about the cupping in the rear apron. The front apron, before I mounted it, it looked and felt straight. Everything was good. It was flat, no twist, everything else. So it stayed perfect. The only one I had a problem with was the rear. So what I did was I basically took a couple of my long clamps, and before the top was glued up, I took and ran it from this end to this end, and just drew it together, just a hair, or not just a hair, but until it wouldn't move closer together anymore in the housing dados. And so now I know that they're fully seated, and I planned on doing that anyways right before I ran the screws up into the top, but that brought it all together to within a 16th, and that is close enough for me. So now, after I got that all solved, got the legs and everything, the whole bench is squared up, true, good to go. Both tops are glued on, the wedge systems are drove in. Now it's just drying time. Tomorrow I'll be fitting up the wellboard and screwing the bench tops down to the bears. And at that point, I got to do some house cleaning and preparation for my landlord coming over and stuff like that. Not that I have to do a whole lot, really, because I'm a pretty clean and neat person to begin with, but I got to clean this area up because it's a shithole right now. And the next thing to do really is mount I got to mount the vices. Well, I'll be able to mount the one vise, which will go just on the outside of this front left leg. So the vise will go right about here. And that is going to be freaking perfect for me. Because if I don't, then I have to miss the wedge on the inside, and it'll put the vise like right here, which is almost, it's too close to the center of the bench for me. And then I also plan on, I told y'all already, but I plan on doing like Dima from Dima's Wood Shop, rabbiting the corners all the way along both sides of the inside of the well and putting tool covers. And then I'm looking at also maybe doing end caps. And then I have to do something with these corners because they're not going to be, there's no reason that I need to leave these corners all out there for, they just don't need to be there. So I'll dress them up with some kind of, I'll shape them somehow, and that'll be that. But we are making progress, and this is where I sit now. Anytime I do something new, I will I will video and keep you guys updated. So until the next time, friends and family, love you. Everybody else, peace.